What if I told you it may not a story? The flood happened, but we forgot. Imagine unfolding a map of the world from 15,000 years ago. The coastlines would look familiar at all. Where the North Sea spreads today, you'd Cyrilline green plains, connecting Britain to the European mainland. The Bering Strait would be a wide land bridge linking Asia to North America. And everywhere you looked, vast stretches of what we call continental shelf would be marked as solid ground. Places where forests grew thick and wild, where people might have lived for thousands of years. Then something happened that changed everything. Roughly 12,800 years ago, the Earth shifted in a way no one expected. Ice that had taken tens of thousands of years to form began to melt. Violently, suddenly, and all at once, massive glacial lakes, some larger than the Great Lakes, combined, broke through their natural dams and sent torrents of meltwater cascading into the oceans. Ocean levels surged with terrifying speed. In less than a geological blink, the shorelines of the world moved inland by hundreds of miles. What was once habitable land simply vanished beneath the waves. Scientists gave a name for this event now: the Younger Dryas. The world got dramatically colder for over 1,000 years, then suddenly warmed at a rate that massive ice sheets couldn't handle. They melted faster than seems possible. No one agrees on what caused such rapid change. Some researchers believe a comet shattered over the North American ice sheet. Others point to massive volcanic eruptions or sudden shifts in ocean currents. What matters is the result. Between 11,000 and 13,000 years ago, global sea levels rose over 120 meters. That's not a myth pulled from ancient texts. That's a measured fact documented in ice cores and sediment layers around the world. Entire coastlines were swallowed. Islands that had stood for thousands of years vanished in a matter of centuries. Forests that had grown for generations were submerged, their root systems eventually becoming part of the seafloor. The reshaping was so massive and so complete that it remains visible even now on undersea maps where marine geologists can still trace the ancient river valleys carved into what is now deep ocean floor. But strangely, we don't talk about this event when we discuss the story of human civilization. We talk about the Holocene warming that followed, the dawn of agriculture, the rise of the first cities, the invention of writing. But rarely do we ask, what came just before that great transition? There's a cultural silence around those crucial millennia, a kind of collective amnesia that feels curiously neat, as if something was deliberately wiped clean before recorded history was allowed to begin. We Homo sapiens have existed for at least 300,000 years. That number is not in dispute among anthropologists. Archaeological evidence shows modern human behavior, sophisticated tool-making, and complex social structures stretching back hundreds of millennia. And yet, the story we tell of ourselves, the narrative of human achievement and civilization, only begins about 6,000 years ago. The Sumerians is with their ununiform tablets, the pyramids rising from the Egyptian desert, the first writing systems that allowed us to record our thoughts and deeds for future generations. So what happened during the other 294,000 years? Why is there no record of that enormous span of time? The standard explanation is straightforward. Earlier humans were nomadic hunter-gatherers who left few permanent traces. They lived lightly on the land, following herds and seasonal patterns, never staying in one place long enough to build anything that would survive the millennia. This explanation works well for inland populations, for people who lived in forests and grasslands and mountain valleys. But it becomes more questionable when you consider where prehistoric humans actually spent most of their time. Archaeological evidence consistently shows that early humans preferred coastal environments. Shores provided reliable food sources: fish, shellfish, seabirds, marine mammals. Rivers offered fresh water and attracted game animals that humans hunted. Estuaries where rivers meet the sea were particularly rich ecosystems that could support larger populations year-round. If you are going to find evidence of early human innovation, permanent settlements, or the first stirrings of complex society, coastal areas would be the most logical places to look, unless maybe there were such settlements. But they're underwater now. And those submerged coastal zones are exactly the regions we haven't explored. They're the missing pages in our story. Only a tiny fraction of the ocean floor has been scanned in any detail. Even less has been excavated by archaeologists. The vast majority of what might remain from humanity's deeper past, settlements, monuments, tools, entire cultures, is not lost. It's just inaccessible, lying beneath hundreds of feet of water and thousands of years of accumulated sediment, waiting for technology and funding to catch up with our curiosity. The Younger Dresd catastrophe may have done more than reshape coastlines. It may have reshaped human memory itself. The survivors' offsick overwhelming change would have been focused on basic survival, finding new homes, new food sources, new ways to live in a world that had been transformed beyond recognition. The knowledge, stories, and achievements of earlier times would have been preserved only in oral tradition, passed down by the few who remembered the world before the waters came. Over generations, these memories would naturally transform. Specific events would become universal symbols. Technical knowledge would be preserved as ritual. Geographic details will evolve into religious imagery. What had once been history would become legend, then myth told around fires by people who had never seen the world their ancestors described. What if the flood didn't just drown land, it drowned time itself? What if the story we tell of ourselves isn't missing a chapter, but missing its beginning entirely? Throughout human history, some stories, the memory that survived the flood, are born in one place and stay there, shaped by local rivers and familiar fears. But there is one story that refuses to behave this way. A story that somehow emerged everywhere at once, as if the entire human family had witnessed the same impossible event, and then scattered to the ends of the earth, each carrying the same memory in different words. In every corner of the world, people remember the day the water came, not the familiar water of rivers and rain, but something alien and overwhelming that rose from below the earth and fell from above the clouds until the familiar world disappeared beneath an endless sea. This is the flood story, and it is everywhere. From the ununiform tablets of ancient Mesopotamia to the oral traditions of isolated Amazon tribes, from the icy legends of the Arctic to the Dreamtime stories of Australia, the same narrative unfolds, with unsettling consistency. Divine warnings arriving just in time, boats constructed according to impossible specifications, animals gathering in great numbers and small groups of survivors floating above the wreckage of everything they had known. Different cultures, but always the same sequence, always the same ending. And that presents a problem for anyone who believes stories travel in logical ways. Walk into any university, anthropology department, and ask about flood myths, and you'll receive a patient explanation that has satisfied scholars for over a century. These stories, you'll be told, are natural products of the human condition. Psychological artifacts born from our universal relationship with water and our collective need to process disaster. The reasoning seems solid now. Every early civilization developed near rivers because water meant life. But rivers also brought death in the form of seasonal flooding. When the Nile overflowed or the Tigris burst its banks, entire communities could be wiped away in a matter of hours. The survivors, traumatized by the sudden transformation of their familiar world into an alien waterscape, would naturally tell stories about divine judgment and moral cleansing. Over generations, these local disaster tales would grow in the telling, becoming cosmic rather than regional, mythological rather than historical. Anthropologists call this convergent myth-making and the tendency for similar stories to emerge independently. In response to similar experiences, flooding is traumatic everywhere. So flood stories develop everywhere. Thebot represents survival. The animals represent hope. The rainbow represents renewal. These are universal human symbols responding to universal human experiences, not evidence of shared historical events. Furthermore, these similarities between cultures can be explained by what scholars term diffusion theory. Stories travel along trade routes carried by merchants, migrants, and missionaries. The flood narrative could have originated in one location, most likely ancient Mesopotamia, where some of the earliest written versions appear, and then spread across the globe through the vast networks of human contact that connected even the most distant civilizations. Recent genetic and archaeological evidence reveals that human populations mixed and migrated far more extensively than previously thought, creating invisible highways along which powerful stories could travel for thousands of years. This academic framework held comfortably for decades. Flood myths were filed away as interesting examples of how human psychology processes trauma, useful for understanding cultural development, but irrelevant to actual history. The matter seemed settled. Then researchers began to count, and the counting revealed something that didn't fit the comfortable explanations. When Sir James Frazer compiled flood stories for his comprehensive study Folklore in the Old Testament in the 1900s, he documented versions from over 200 cultures across 6 continents. What struck him wasn't just the number of stories, it was their structural similarity. These weren't elusive variations on a theme, but narratives that followed the same precise sequence: divine warning, chosen survivor, vessel construction, animal preservation, global destruction, gradual recession, new beginning. This isn't coincidence. It's too precise, too structured, too universal to be random cultural invention. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Mesopotamia around 2100 BCE, contains perhaps the most detailed version of the flood story. But the same core elements appear in the Shatapatha Brahmana of ancient India, in the Greek tale of Deucalion and Pyrrha, in the Maya Popol Vuh, and in Aboriginal oral traditions from Australia. Different contents, different languages, different gods, but always the same fundamental structure. What makes these stories even more unsettling is how precisely organized they are, as if they weren't just myths created for entertainment, but instructions encoded for survival. Because the survivors in these stories don't just rebuild civilization, they remember it. They carry forward specific knowledge that allows the world to continue. Zusra receives divine wisdom and immortality. Manu brings back the concepts of agriculture and sacred law. No preserves not just animal species, but the idea of covenant between divine and human. Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulate Thirth and restore justice. They aren't just lucky individuals who happen to serve. They are deliberate transmitters chosen specifically to carry certain knowledge across the catastrophic divide. The flood in these stories doesn't merely destroy. It selects what deserves to survive and what should be forgotten. And what survives isn't random. It's always the fundamental building blocks of civilization. How to grow food, how to organize society, how to maintain relationships with the divine, how to begin again when everything familiar has been swept away. This suggests that these myths serve a deeper function than simple storytelling. They're templates for survival, cultural instruction manuals disguised as religious narratives. If a catastrophe really did occur, one that wiped out coastal settlements and displaced populations across the globe, then physical monuments would be destroyed, written records would be lost, and sophisticated technologies would vanish. But stories can survive anything. They move from mouth to mouth, from parent to child, carried like seeds across time and distance. They can cross language barriers, adapt to new cultures, and preserve essential information even when the original context has been completely forgotten. And over generations, the trauma of real events can transform into the rhythm of myth. The warning, the preparation, the catastrophe, the loss, the survival, the renewal. If we now know from geological evidence that sea levels rose over 120 mat, the end of the last ice age, drowning millions of square km of inhabited coastline, then the world that these stories remember losing wasn't imaginary. It was geographic. The flood wasn't metaphorical. It was the single greatest environmental catastrophe in human history. Perhaps that's why so many cultures treat the flood not as a simple disaster, but as a fundamental boundary in human experience. A wall across time that separates two different worlds. Before the flood, something else existed. A different kind of civilization, a different relationship between humans and their environment, different knowledge and different possibilities. After the flood, the world we now recognize took shape, built on the foundations of what could be salvaged from what came before. The consistency of these flood myths suggests something even more intriguing. They may represent humanity's oldest surviving historic memory, preserved not in stone or metal, but in the most durable medium available to pre-iterate society's story itself. They're ancient documents encoded in metaphor and symbol, but containing genuine information about humanity's most transformative experience. Fairy tales that seem most fantastical, divine warnings, miraculous preservation, supernatural guidance might be symbolic ways of describing real survival strategies, real preparations, real knowledge that allowed some communities to endure what others could not. The flood stories are also presented as foundational narratives, the events that separate the ancient world from the world of historical memory. Everything before the flood is prehistory, dimly remembered, incompletely understood, populated by giants and heroes and impossibility events. Everything after the flood is the beginning of the world we recognize, where human limitations are clearly defined and divine intervention follows predictable patterns. This narrative structure suggests that the flood represents more than physical catastrophe. It marks an epistemological break, a fundamental change in how humans understood their place in the world. Whatever knowledge, technologies, or social structures existed before the flood became literally unthinkable afterward, preserved only in fragments wrapped in mythological language that later generations would interpret as fantasy rather than memory. Standing in any modern library surrounded by thousands of years of recorded human thought, it's easy to assume that important knowledge gets preserved automatically. But flood myths remind us how fragile human memory really is and how much can be lost when the physical foundations of civilization are swept away. They also suggest that our ancestors were far more sophisticated than we imagine in their methods of preserving essential information across catastrophic conditions. Maybe these stories weren't written for entertainment or religious instruction. Maybe they were designed as cultural DNA, information compressed into memorable, repeatable forms that could survive the collapse of everything else. Because if language fails and tools are lost and knowledge drowns, the one thing that can make it across a broken world is a story shaped like a circle. One that contains its own instructions for repetition and renewal. The flood comes, the world ends as survivor remains. Knowledge is preserved. Civilization bends again. What if myth was never meant to be believed in the way we understand belief? What if it was meant to be remembered, repeated, and eventually decoded by people who had developed the tools to recognize historical truth buried beneath layers of symbolic language? What if the most important information about our past isn't hidden in ruins we haven't found yet, but in stories we stopped taking seriously long ago? The first clue to a civilization older, the temple that shouldn't exist in Sumer, long considered humanity's oldest, dating back 6,000 years, appears on a barren hill in the Turkish countryside, where nothing should have happened. The landscape stretches flat and barren in every direction, marked only by scattered rocks and stubborn patches of grass that struggle against relentless sun. No rivers wind through this terrain to provide easy irrigation. No mountains rise nearby to offer valuable minerals. No natural harbors or trade routes justify human settlement. By every logical measure, this should be empty land, the kind of place ancient peoples would have walked past without a second glance. And yet, when archaeologists began digging into the dry soil of Göbekli in the 1990s, they found something that shouldn't exist according to everything we thought we knew about early human civilization. A ring of pillars, T-shaped, towering 15 feet into the air, each one carved from single blocks of limestone weighing several tons. And not just randomly placed, arranged in perfect circles, aligned with astronomical precision, and etched with symbols that no one alive can fully explain. The oldest part of this site has been radiocarbon dated to around 9,600 BCE. That's more than 11,000 years ago, making it older than pottery, older than writing, older than agriculture itself, which means someone at the very end of the last ice age quarried these massive stones, transported them across difficult terrain, and stood them upright in complex geometric patterns, all without the supposed benefits of farming, metal tools, or permanent settlements. But there was no one lived at Göbekli. Despite decades of excavation, archaeologists have found no signs of permanent habitation, no houses or storage areas, no burials or cemeteries. No evidence of the domestic activitius mark every other ancient settlement. Just these great stone enclosures rising from bedrock like frozen prayers, arranged as if for massive gatherings. But of whom and for what purpose? Each pillar is covered in intricate carvings that seem to tell a story we can no longer read. Animals emerge from the stone with startling realism. Foxes with bushy tails, wild boars with prominent tusks, scorpions with curved stingers, vultures with outstretched wings, snakes coiled and ready to strike. Abstract symbols appear alongside them. Crescents, hate shapes, circles pierced by lines. Geometric patterns that repeat across the site with mathematical precision. There's no inscription, no written language we can decipher. But the symbols repeat not just across Göbekli, but across otherworldly discovered sites in the same region, as if they're part of a visual code, a symbolic language whose meaning died with its creators. Some researchers suggest these carvings represent astronomical observations, a frozen sky map carved in stone to track celestial movements. Others believe they're mythological, depicting a cosmology and creation story that predates all known religions. There are even those who think Göbekli preserves the memory of a catastrophic event, a celestial warning embedded in sculpture, meant to serve whatever catastrophe had already occurred. But here's the most unsettling part of the Göbekli mystery. After building and using it for perhaps a few centuries, the people who created this extraordinary site didn't abandon it. They didn't let it crumble into ruins like countless other ancient structures. They buried it deliberately and methodically. They filled in the spaces between the pillars with tons of stone and debris, sealing the enclosures beneath a man-made hill layer by careful layer. This wasn't destruction, it was preservation. As if they wanted it to survive the ages, just not be seen. As if they were protecting it from something, or saving it for someone who would come later. And Göbekli is not alone in this strange pattern. Karaheep, just 30 miles away, follows the same mysterious blueprint. Nearly before it was flooded by a modern dam, showed identical features. Sites across the region, now called the Stone Hills, are emerging from systematic excavation. Each one older than conventional history says should be possible. Each one built by hands that supposedly lack the organization and technology for such undertakings. They share unmistakable patterns. No dwellings, no graves, T-shaped pillars carved from local limestone, animal symbols that repeat from site to site, and one by one, they were all deliberately buried. This isn't coincidence. It's a deliberate pattern carried out across multiple locations over an extended period of time. But it's not a pattern that fits within our accepted view of how human civilization deved. According to established archaeology, Complex religious architecture should emerge slowly from simpler beginnings. Monumental construction should follow the development of agriculture, permanent settlements, and social hierarchies. Sacred sites should show evidence of the communities that built and maintained them. But Göbekli Tepe and its sister cities violate every one of these expectations. This isn't evolution. It's interruption, like something survived a great reset of human history just long enough to leave a message behind before disappearing again into the earth. The implications are staggering when you consider the timing. Göbekli Tepe was built during the Thesan period when global sea levels were rising 120 meters, when coastlines around Thule were disappearing beneath the waves, when the Younger Dry catastrophe was reshaping the planet's climate and geography. Could these sites represent something that survived from the world before the flood? Recent discovery suggests that Göbekli Tepe may have been abandoned and buried around 8000 BCE. Roughly coinciding with the end of the post-glacial flooding period. Was this timing coincidental, or does it point to some connection between the Great Drowning and the Great Burying? The people who built these sites possessed knowledge we're only beginning to glimpse. They understood astronomy well enough to align their structures with celestial events. They had sophisticated giant skills that allowed them to work with stones weighing many tons. They shared a symbolic language complex enough to convey meaning across multiple sites over extended periods. And they had the social organization necessary to coordinate massive construction projects without leaving any trace of the infrastructure that should have supported such efforts. Then they vanished, leaving behind only their buried monuments and the growing suspicion that we've been telling ourselves the wrong story about human history. Standing among the excavated pillars of Göbekli Tepe today, you can't shake the feeling that you're looking at something that doesn't belong in our timeline. The craftsmanship is too sophisticated, the planning too complex, the purpose too mysterious. It's as if these ancient builders were working from a completely different playbook than the one we've written for early human development. And that changes everything about how we understand the past. Because if you accept that Göbekli Tepe existed before civilization was supposed to begin, then maybe civilization didn't begin 6,000 years ago. Maybe it restarted. Maybe these stone circles weren't temples built for worship, but time capsules designed to preserve something precious through a period of great forgetting. Maybe they weren't built for the gods at all. Maybe they were built for us, the people who would eventually dig them up and wonder what they meant. The people who would need to remember what had been lost beneath the waves. The next clue lies not on land, cities beneath the waves, but deep beneath the waves, where 12,000 years ago ancient coastlines once stretched, where early civilizations may have flourished before rising seas claimed them forever. Beneath the surface of today's seas, real cities lie hidden. Not in stories, not in allegory, but in stone. In the shallow waters off coast of Israel, a diver moves silently across the seabed. Sunlight filters down in fractured beams, revealing something that shouldn't be there. Walls, not coral formation shaped by currents. Not shipwrecks claimed by storms, but walls cut and placed by human hands. Stone pathways wind between what were once courtyards, and in the center of it all, a freshwater well stands intact, its circular stones still perfectly arranged after thousands of years beneath the waves. This is Atlantis, and it tells a story that changes everything we thought we knew about the past. 9,000 years ago, this was a thriving coastal settlement. Its people buried their dead in careful circles of standing stones. They fished the waters, built homes with stone foundations, and dug wells that reached fresh water beneath the salt. Archaeological evidence shows they lived here for generations, developing a complex society that included skilled craftsmen, organized burial practices, and even some of the earliest known cases of tuberculosis in human remains. Then the sea rose, not with a single catastrophic wave, not in a mythic surge that swallowed everything in an instant, but slowly, relentlessly, like a tide pulling time backward. The people of Atlat Yam would have watched their world disappear, inch by inch, season by season, until finally they had to abandon everything they had built and walk away from the only home they had ever known. And Atlat Yam isn't alone. Just south of the Greek mainland, beneath less than 4 meters of crystal-clear water, lie the ruins of Pavel Petri, an entire Bronze Age city that offers perhaps the most complete underwater urban landscape ever discovered. Here, marine archaeologists have mapped not just scattered foundations, but an intricate urban plan, roads wide enough for ancient carts to navigate, building foundations that clearly show individual room layouts, courtyards where families once gathered, and storage areas where grain was kept for difficult seasons. This isn't just a settlement. It's a sophisticated city dating back over 5,000 years, complete with what appears to be a planned street grid that wouldn't look out of place in a modern urban planning textbook. The preservation at Pavri is so remarkable that divers can literally swim down ancient streets and peer into rooms where people once conducted their daily lives. Pottery fragments still litter the floors where they were dropped. Stone tools remain scattered in workshops. Bronze Age artifacts lie exactly where their owners left them when rising waters forced the sites abandoned. It's as if the entire settlement was frozen in time at the moment the sea arrived, creating an underwater museum of ancient urban life that provides unprecedented insights into how sophisticated city planning had come thousands of years before we assumed such capabilities existed. Off the coast of Gujarat in western India, marine surveys have detected extensive underwater structures near the legendary city of Dwarka, mentioned in ancient Sanskrit texts as the magnificent capital built by Lord Krishna. What makes these discoveries particularly intriguing is how closely the underwater remains match descriptions from the Mahabharata and other Hindu epics, texts that many scholars once dismissed as purely mythological. Sonar scans and underwater exploration shiv revealed massive stone walls, intricately carved steps, temple foundations, and arranged blocks that form geometric patterns too regular to be natural formations. The dating of Dwarka's underwater ruins remains contentious. Some researchers suggest these structures could be over 9,000 years old, which would make them among the oldest urban settlements ever discovered and would dramatically push back the timeline of sophisticated city building in South Asia. Other archaeologists argue for much more recent dates, pointing to the challenges of underwater archaeology and the difficulty of finding reliable samples from marine environments. But regardless of their exact age, the structures are undeniably there, lying beneath the Arabian Sea in configurations that suggest planned construction rather than natural geological processes. The discovery has forced archaeologists to take seriously ancient texts they had previously considered purely legendary, raising questions about how much historical truth might be preserved in what we've categorized as mythology. None of the cities claim to be the first human settlements. None lie deep enough to predate the end of the last ice age. They're not remnants of some lost super-civilization or evidence of ancient technologies beyond our understanding, but they all prove something devastatingly simple. That water rises, that cities can vanish, and that memory if placed too close to the shore becomes driftwood scattered by time. And it redefines us where we should be looking for human history. All of these cities, Atlam, Pavla, Petetri, Dwara, were discovered by accident in relatively shallow water, near modern coastlines. But if sea levels rose as dramatically as we know they did, then where are the settlements that once stood farther out in the continental shelves? Less than 20% of the ocean floor has been properly mapped. Less than 1% has been systematically examined for archaeological remains. And yet, for most of human existence, coastlines were at the heart of survival, providing food, fresh water, moderate climate, and routes for trade and movement. It's almost certain that earlier settlements dotted those ancient shores, perhaps in greater numbers and sophistication than anything we found on dry land. But those shores are gone, and so is everything that once touched them. The implications become staggering when you consider the pattern. Every underwater city discovered so far was found in shallow, accessible water close to modern coastlines. These are just the outermost edges of what was once a much larger coastal zone. If we're finding organized settlements at the very margins of the drowned landscape, what might lie deeper in the areas that were once the prime real estate of the ancient world? Consider this. If archaeologists from the future wanted to understand our civilization, but they could only excavate the areas that are currently more than 400 feet above sea level, what would they conclude? They might find scattered mountain towns, mining operations, maybe a few high-altitude research stations, but they would miss every major coastal city, every port, every center of commerce and culture. They would conclude that early 21st century humans were a sparse, primitive people who never developed complex urban societies. That may be exactly the mistake we're making about our own past. The cities we find beneath the waves today are not proof of a lost civilization that predates the flood, but they are proof of a process, a slow erasure that doesn't need fire or conquest, just time and rising water. They're evidence that human achievement has been systematically removed from the historical record, not by some conspiracy or catastrophe, but by the simple fact that people have always lived near water and water levels change. Standing on any modern beach, you're looking at a boundary that didn't exist 12,000 years ago. Somewhere beneath those waves, ancient streets still follow their original paths, wells still hold fresh water, sacred space still wait in the darkness. The difference is that we've barely begun to look for them. History may not be hidden in some impossible realm. It may simply be waiting beneath the tide, holding its breath in the darkness, preserving secrets that could change everything we think we know about the human story. And if we had the courage to dive deeper to explore the vast underwater landscapes we've ignored, we might discover that the missing chapters of human civilization aren't missing at all. They're just sleeping in the depths. Thea monument buried twice of their clue emerges in West Java, Indonesia. But this time, the scientific ominous reaction isn't excitement. It's suspicious silence. At first glance, it's just a hill. Mount Padang rises gently from the landscape. Its slopes covered in wild grass and scattered with weathered basalt blocks. It looks like 100 other forgotten places across the archipelago. The kind of spot where locals come for weekend hikes and children play hide-and-seek among the stones. Nothing about it suggests that beneath your feet lies one of the most controversial archaeological discoveries of the modern era. But something extraordinary lies beneath that unremarkable surface. In the early 2010 South, a team of Indonesian geologists and archaeologists began probing deeper into Mount Padang structure. What they found wasn't a natural hill at all. It was something far more complex and far more unsettling. Using ground-penetrating radar, core drilling, and seismic tomography, they mapped layers of deliberately arranged stone buried beneath the surface. Chambers, columns, stacked terraces, walls of cut rock arranged in patterns too precise to be natural. The deeper they looked, the more elaborate the structure became. Seismic scans revealed multiple layers of construction with the deepest level showing evidence of sophisticated engineering. Stone blocks weighing several tons had been quarried, shaped, and positioned with geometric precision. Underground chambers and corridors stretched through the interior like the rooms of a buried city. And then they took samples from the organic material found between the stone layers. Radiourban dating returned numbers that shouldn't have been possible. The organic matter, plant fragments, soil, and other materials embedded in the construction dated back over 20,000 years. Not the stones themselves, which could be ancient anywhere, but the evidence of human activity, the proof that people had deliberately arranged these massive blocks in complex patterns during the last ice age. This wasn't just another megalithic site. If the dates were accurate, Mount Padang would be the oldest monumental architecture ever discovered, predating Göbekli by nearly 10,000 years and pushing back the timeline of human civilization by millennia. And that was when the real problems began. Mount Padang wasn't destroyed by floods or earthquakes. It wasn't lost to time or hidden by natural disasters. It was discovered, studied, and documented. And then, in one of the most troubling examples of academic suppression in recent memory, it was buried again, not by earth, but by institutional silence. The academic reaction was swift and decisive. Papers presenting the radiourban data were a contest, then withdrawn from publication. Excavation permits were suddenly revoked. Research funding vanished. The Indonesian archaeologists who had made the discovery found themselves professionally isolated, their methodology questioned, their interpretations dismissed as speculative and unscientific. But this wasn't about fabricated evidence or fraudulent research. Thicker samples existed. The radiourban dates had been confirmed by multiple laboratories. The geophysical surveys clearly showed artificial structures beneath the hill. The problem wasn't the data, it was the implications. If Mount Padang really was 20,000 years old, then everything archaeology had established about the development of human civilization would need to bear considered. The neat timeline that placed the first monumental architecture at Göbekli around 9600 BCE would be shattered. The assumption that complex societies only emerged after the development of agriculture would be challenged. The entire narrative of human progress from simple hunter-gatherers to sophisticated builders would require fundamental revision. We like to think of archaeology as a purely objective science, a process of careful excavation and neutral interpretation that gradually reveals the truth about our past. But Mount Padang demonstrates something more uncomfortable. Sometimes the truth becomes inconvenient, and when it does, institutional forces can be remarkably effective at making inconvenient discoveries disappear. Today, Mount Padang still stands. In West Java, its secrets still buried beneath layers of stone and soil. The core samples still exist in storage facilities, their radiourban dates unchanged by academic disapproval. But official story has reverted to the safe, familiar version. Mount Padang is just a hill with some scattered megalithic stones on its summit, probably built a few thousand years ago as a ceremonial site. Nothing more. Nothing that challenges established anomalies or forces uncomfortable questions. The deeper layers, the sophisticated engineering, the evidence of Ice Age construction, all of it has been officially forgotten, sealed behind bureaucratic walls as effectively as if it had been buried under tons of earth. But the strangeness of Mount Padang goes beyond the controversy surrounding its age. The very structure of the site suggests something far more complex than a simple ceremonial platform. Its geometry isn't random. The entire complex appears to be oriented according to specific astronomical alignments. Its interior, based on seismic scans, contains voids and corridors that no modern archaeologist has been permitted to explore. Most mysteriously, the construction shows evidence of multiple building phases, as if successive generations had built upon and modified the work of their predecessors over thousands of years. Like other controversial sites around the world, Mount Padang follows a pattern that doesn't fit comfortable evolutionary models of human development. It doesn't merge gradually from simpler predecessors. It doesn't show clear connections to contemporary cultures. It just appears fully formed and sophisticated, like an archaeological anomaly that belongs to a different mine entirely. And like Göbekli, Mount Padang appears to have been deliberately buried by its creators. The evidence suggests that sometime in the distant past, people made the conscious decision to cover this massive structure with earth and stones, hiding it from view. Were they preserving it for future generations, protecting it from some catastrophe, or marking the end of an era that could never return? The parallel is striking. A monument buried once by its ancient builders, then buried again by modern academics unwilling to confront what it might mean. Two different kinds of covering up, separated by thousands of years, but motivated by the same impulse: the need to control which version of the past gets to survive. Standing on the grassy slopes of Mount Padang today, knowing what lies beneath, but being forbidden to explore it, you begin to understand something troubling about the nature of knowledge itself. Truth isn't always welcome. Discovery isn't always celebrated. Sometimes the most important findings are the ones that get quietly pushed aside, not because they're false, but because they're too true to be comfortable. This raises questions that extend far beyond archaeology. How many other sites around the world might contain evidence of earlier, more sophisticated civilizations? How many discoveries have been made but never published, discussed but never investigated, found but never officially acknowledged? If Mount Padang can be effectively erased from the archaeological record, despite physical evidence of its age and complexity, what else might be hiding in plain sight? The real tragedy of Mount Padang isn't just that it challenges our understanding of the past. It's that it reveals how fragile that understanding really is, and how easily inconvenient truths can be made to disappear. We think of ourselves as living in an age of unprecedented access to information. But Mount Padang suggests that some information is still too dangerous to be allowed into the light. The hill still keeps its secrets locked beneath layers of stone and bureaucracy. But somewhere, in those buried chambers and sealed corridors, evidence waits that could reshape everything we think we know about human history. What if the greatest challenge in understanding our past isn't that the evidence has been lost, but that it's already been found and deliberately forgotten? What if the most important discoveries are the ones we're not allowed to make? Mount Padang stands as a reminder that sometimes the deepest burial isn't done by time or nature, but by the human need to keep certain truths safely underground. The stones with no ancestors. There's something strange about Earth's most ancient structures. They appear without ancestors. No crude versions or trial phases, just sudden perfection. It's the size that hits you first. One block at Baalbek, Lebanon, measures over 19 meters long, 4 meters wide, and 3 meters thick. It weighs more than 800 tons, roughly equivalent to 400 automobiles stacked into a single piece of limestone. It lies abandoned in an ancient quarry, half buried in earth and debris, as if waiting for machinery that would never arrive. Yet somehow 3 similar stones, each weighing over 400 tons, were not only moved from this same quarry, but transported uphill and placed with millimeter precision to form the foundation of what would become the Temple of Jupiter. They sit there today, stacked in a line so perfectly that the margins between them are too narrow for a knife blade to penetrate. This wasn't the work of Roman engineers, though Romans certainly tried to take credit. They built their temple on top of these massive foundation stones. But even Roman historians acknowledged that the lower levels predated their civilization. They called it the work of giants. And perhaps that was the most honest explanation they could offer. Baalbek represents just one piece of a global puzzle that challenges everything we think we know about ancient construction capabilities. In the highlands of Peru, at the fortress complex of Sacsayhuaman, the stonework seems to bend the laws of physics. Blocks weighing over 100 tons are carved in complex polygonal shapes. No two exactly alike, yet fitted together like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle with no mortar to hold them in place. Some stones have 12, even 14 precisely cut edges that mate perfectly with their neighbors. The walls have survived earthquakes that destroyed everything else built in the region, testament to engineering that seems to surpass modern understanding. This wasn't built through trial and error or lucky guesswork. It was engineered by people who understood principles of construction that we're still trying to figure out. But when Spanish conquistadors asked the Inca, who had built these incredible fortifications, they were told that the stonework predated their empire. The Inca Sati were made by the gods before human memory began. Archaeologists attribute these sites to pre-Inca cultures, but there are no detailed records of how the work was accomplished. No construction plans, no evidence of the tools that would have been required, no partially completed projects that might show the learning process. Just the finished product, standing in silent testimony, took up abilities that appeared from nowhere and left no trace of their development. The mystery deepens at Puma, Punku near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. The site looks like someone began an ambitious construction project and then suddenly vanished, leaving behind evidence of technical sophistication that seems impossible for its time period. The andesite stones here are cut with such machine-like accuracy that modern engineers struggle to explain how it could have been accomplished with primitive tools. Perfect 90 angles that remain precise after more than 1,000 years. Interior. Channels carved with geometric precision. Drill-like holes that penetrate dense volcanic rock in patterns that serve no obvious structural purpose. Complex interlocking shapes that could only have been planned using sophisticated three-dimensional modeling. Yet, archaeological evidence suggests these accomplishments were achieved by a culture that supposedly had no metal tools, no written language, and no wheels. The absence of copper chisels, iron blades, or any other metal implements at these sites forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. How do you achieve machine precision stonework using nothing but stone tools and human labor? These sites are mysterious because they're beautiful or impressive. They're mysterious because they don't fit any recognizable pattern of technological development. In every other aspect of human achievement, we can trace clear evolutionary progress. Pottery starts crude and becomes refined. Metallurgy begins with simple techniques and gradually develops complexity. Writing systems evolve from basic symbols to sophisticated scripts. But not here. These megalithic achievements appear fully formed, as if the knowledge required to create them had somehow dropped out of nowhere, been applied with perfect execution, and then vanished without leaving any trace of how it was acquired or transmitted. In archaeology, we expect to find evidence of learning curves, trial and error, failed experiments, and gradual improvements. When humans develop new capabilities, they typically build small projects first, then progressively larger ones as their confidence and skill increase. We expect to find workshops where techniques were refined, schools where knowledge was transmitted, and waste piles where mistakes were discarded. None of that exists at these sites. No crude diversions, no partially completed prototypes, no evidence of the infrastructure that should have supported such massive undertakings. No ancestors in the archaeological record that might explain where these capabilities came from. The conventional explanations range from teams of thousands of workers using ropes, levers, and endless patience to more exotic theories involving lost technologies or extraterrestrial intervention. But both extremes reveal the same uncomfortable truth. We're essentially guessing. The mathematical calculus required to move 800-ton stones uphill using primitive methods didn't add up. The precision required to create drill-cut channels inside andesite blocks exceeds what should be possible with stone tools. The engineering sophistication needed to build earthquake-resistant walls and active seismic zones suggests knowledge that we've only recently developed ourselves. Perhaps we're asking the wrong questions. Instead of wondering how these sites were built, maybe we should be asking why we can't find evidence of anything that came before them. Why didn't these remarkable achievements have technological ancestors? Why do they appear in the archaeological record like islands of impossible capability, surrounded by oceans of more primitive construction? It's as if we're looking at the final echoes of something rather than the first attempts at something new. Not the beginning of architectural achievement, but the residue of a civilization that already understood principles we've spent millennia trying to rediscover. The global distribution of these anomalies makes the mystery even more troubling. Baalbek in Lebanon, Sacsayhuaman in Peru, Pumapunku in Bolivia. These sites are separated by thousands of miles and supposedly built by cultures that had no contact with each other. Yet they all share the same unnerving characteristics: technical sophistication that appears without precedent, precision that exceeds apparent capabilities, and complete absence of developmental evidence. Standing among these massive stones today, you can't escape the feeling that you're looking at something that doesn't belong in our timeline. The craftsmanship is too sophisticated, the engineering too advanced, the execution too perfect for the technological context in which it supposedly occurred. It's as if these ancient builders were working from a completely different playbook than the one we've written for human development, which raises a possibility that most historians refuse to acknowledge openly. What if these weren't the first attempts to build something lasting? What if they represent the final achievements of knowledge systems that were already ending? What if these stones are not monuments to human progress, but memorials to human loss? The last desperate attempts to preserve capabilities that were about to disappear forever. The silence before and after these achievements becomes even more meaningful in this context. Perhaps the absence of technological ancestors isn't because the knowledge was newly developed, but because it was already old, already fading, already down to its final practitioners who knew that time was running out. Maybe these stones weren't built to celebrate the beginning of something new. Maybe they were built to remember something that was ending, carved with such precision and placed with such care because their creators knew they might be the last evidence that such knowledge had ever existed at all. We think of the past as something buried, something hidden in the forgotten shoreline deserts, mountains, caves, places where wind and time have slowly revealed what once was hidden. But maybe it isn't buried at all. Maybe it's just underwater. At the peak of the last ice age, sea levels were more than 120 meters lower than today. The continents look different then. Islands that we navigate around today didn't exist. Land bridge connected what we now call separate nations. And the shorelines, the real ones where people actually lived, lay far beyond where we stand today. That's where people lived, not on mountain tops or in wastelands, but near water. Always near water, where rivers met the sea, where food was abundant, where travel and trade were possible. That's where early humanity built its first villages, established its first trade routes, and told its first stories. And when the ice melted and the waters rose, that's what disappeared first. We've spent over a century digging in dry places, deserts where stone survives, highlands where erosion exposes ancient foundations. But what if the most advanced settlements, the ones built with care and knowledge and meaning, weren't buried by time? What if they were drowned by it? Look at any modern map of human population density. Even today, with all our technology and transportation networks, 70% of humanity lives within 100 kilometers off sea. Coastal regions host our largest cities, our busiest ports, our most complex civilizations. Why would it be any different 12,000 years ago? Why would our ancestors, who depended even more heavily on natural resources and water access, have chosen to live anywhere else? Yet, we've barely looked beneath the waves for evidence of their existence. Only 0.05% of the ocean floor has been archaeologically explored. Not because there's nothing there, but because it's hard, because it's expensive, because underwater archaeology wasn't the priority when the field was developing its methods and focus. We've forgotten the coastlines our ancestors used to walk. We've redrawn the map of human possibility without asking who once lived where the water now lies. There are hints of what we're missing. In the North Sea, beneath the waves, lies Doggerland, a sunken world that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. When fishing trawlers accidentally bring up artifacts from these depths, archaeologists find stone tools, animal bones, and hearthstones, evidence of a drowned landscape where people lived, worked, and built their lives for thousands of years. But there are no monuments there that we've found, no temples or permanent structures. Maybe because they've been washed away by millennia of currents and storms. Maybe because we haven't dug deep enough beneath the accumulated sediment. Farther east, a vast landmass once connected Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Scientists call it Sunderland now, but during the Ice Age, it was a continent-sized shelf supporting ecosystems and human populations for tens of thousands of years. Archaeological evidence shows that early humans crossed this landmass as they migrated from Asia to Australia, establishing communities and developing technologies along the way. But we've mapped only a tiny fraction of this submerged world and excavated even less. The same is true for India's offshore continental shelves, Japan's southern underwater plateaus, the Gulf of Cam, the Florida platform, and the West African coast. All were once dry land. All would have been prime locations for early civilizations to develop. All are now archaeologically ignored. We assume there's nothing significant to find because we haven't found anything significant yet. But we haven't found anything because we've never really conducted a systematic search. It's a circular logic that keeps us looking in sane places while ignoring the most likely locations for major discoveries. Every year that passes makes the task more difficult. Storms shift sediment, burying potential sites deeper. Coral reefs grow over ancient structures. Salt water corrodes organic materials and metal artifacts. What was once a clearly defined city or settlement becomes a vague ridge on the ocean floor. A distorted image on sonar scans, a whisper in the geological data. But some of those whispers are getting louder. In recent years, marine surveys have detected anomalies on the ocean floor. Unnatural shapes, straight ridges, orthogonal lines where none should exist according to natural geological processes. Geometric patterns that suggest human construction, buried beneath meters of sediment. Are they cities, ceremonial structures? Harbor installations, natural formations that happen to look artificial? We don't know best. In most cases, no one has returned to investigate further. The initial discovery gets noted, filed away, and forgotten as research budgets move on to more accessible projects on land. The silence of the underwater archaeological record doesn't prove that nothing important existed there. It might just mean that no one has asked the right questions yet, or developed the right technologies to answer them, or committed the necessary resources to systematic exploration. And that should trouble us more than it apparently does, because if an advanced civilization did exist before the Great Flood, if the myths and scattered evidence we've examined in previous chapters point to something real, then this is where we would find the proof. Not scattered across desert highlands or preserved in isolated mountain valleys, but concentrated along the submerged continental shelves where human populations would naturally have gathered. The most sophisticated settlements, the largest populations, the most advanced technologies, the most important cultural centers. All of these would have developed in coastal regions with access to marine resources, river systems, and natural harbors. When few waters rose, these would have been the first and most completely submerged. We've been looking for lost civilizations in all the wrong places. We've prioritized archaeological convenience over archaeological logic. The forgotten shorelines are not lost. They're waiting beneath layers of sediment and centuries of neglect, holding whatever secrets our ancestors built along the edges of a world that no longer exists. The evidence we seek, the proof that human civilization might be far older and more sophisticated than our current timeline suggests, may be lying just offshore from every major landmass in water depths that are challenging but not impossible to explore with current technology. The memory that refuses to deflood never ended. It just changed shape. It rose as water, swallowing coastlines and cities. It came as fire, burning libraries and temples. It terrified as silence, erasing languages and lineages, and then inevitably it came back again. We imagine the Great Flood as a single event, a moment in time when everything changed. But across the geological record, the mythic traditions, and the buried coastlines of our planet, the same pattern recurs with unsettling regularity. Something is built, something is lost, something survives. 12,000 years ago, the ice melted and sea levels rose by 120 meters. A vast portion of human history vanished beneath the waves, taking with it whatever knowledge, achievements, and memories had accumulated along the world's coastlines, where early civilizations would naturally have developed. But it didn't vanish completely. It reappeared in fragments in a temple that shouldn't text, built with precision that predates the supposed invention of complex society, in myths repeated on opposite sides of the world by cultures that supposedly never met. In carvings that seem too sophisticated for the hands that made them. What does that pattern mean? Maybe we didn't just lotion civilization to the rising waters. Maybe the earth resets itself, not all at once, in a single catastrophic moment, but often enough to fracture human memory into pieces that drift across time and space, colliding and resettling in new combinations that we mistake for coincidence. But some pieces refuse to stay buried. The myth of a world-ending flood appears everywhere. The story of a chosen survivor who preserves knowledge and rebuilds civilization echoes across continents. Each discovery taken alone can be dismissed. Each mystery has possible mundane explanations. Each anomaly might be just another example of human creativity expressing itself in similar ways under similar circumstances. But together they draw contour, not of a specific lost civilization with particular technologies or beliefs, but of something more elusive, a recurrent intelligence, a persistent pattern, a rhythm that human memory keeps trying to recreate even when the original context has been completely forgotten. As if the past is not content to be lost. As if something once known keeps leaking through the cracks in our carefully constructed timeline. And here we are looking back across the water that covered our origins, reading stones whose meaning we've forgotten, measuring galaxies that point to knowledge we don't possess, naming underwater cities didn't build, trying to finish sentences that were started before we were born by people whose existence we can barely acknowledge. The real mystery may not be what we lost in the flood. The real mystery may be why some essential part of it keeps coming back again and again in new myths, new ruins, new symbols that seem to carry the same urgent message in languages we no longer speak. Standing among the megaliths of any ancient site, you can feel it. That presents of something that transcends the specific culture that built it. Knowledge that seems too fundamental to be lost, too important to disappear completely. Too persistent to be forgotten, no matter how many times catastrophe reshapes the world. If this has happened before, if human civilization has risen and fallen and risen again, multiple times, each cycle preserving fragments of what came before, while losing the context that made those fragments meaningful, then we are not just the descendants of flood survivors. We are participants in a loop we still don't understand. The cycle becomes visible when you step back far enough to see the whole pattern. Advanced knowledge appears suddenly in the archaeological record without clear predecessors. Sophisticated understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering emerges among cultures we assume were primitive. Myths about previous worlds and lost wisdom echo across every continent. Massive construction projects undertaken for reasons we can't fathom, then deliberately buried or abandoned. Evidence of capabilities that exceed what we expect from their historical context, followed by apparent forgetting and decline. It's as if humanity periodically reaches a level of achievement and understanding, then loses it to some recurring catastrophe, geological, climatic, social, or cosmic, and has to begin again from fragments and half-remembered stories. Each time the rebuilding process produces variations on the same themes. Flood myths, astronomical observations, monumental architecture, sacred geometry, star maps, cycles of time. Tech knowledge survives, but the context disappears. The memory refuses to die, but it transforms into something we can no longer recognize as memory. Perhaps that's why ancient sites feel so familiar yet so strange. Perhaps that's why flood myths resonate so deeply across cultures. Perhaps that's why we're drawn to mysteries that seem to point toward capabilities and knowledge that human civilization supposedly never possessed. We're not discovering something entirely foreign. We're rediscovering something we once knew. And that raises the most unsettling question of all. If we are indeed living within a recurring cycle of rise and fall, advancement and catastrophe, memory and forgetting, then what will we leave behind when our turn comes? When the next flood arrives, whether it commesses water, fire, or some form of forgetting we can't yet imagine, what traces of our civilization will survive to puzzle future archaeologists? A myth about people who could fly through the sky and speak across vast distances, ruins of massive structures whose purpose cannot be determined, symbols and technologies that seem impossibly advanced for people who supposedly lived in primitive conditions, stories about a time when all human knowledge could be accessed instantly, when images and voices could be captured and preserved forever, when people could see the entire world from space. Maybe we're already creating the mystery that future civilizations will struggle to solve. Maybe the cycle has already begun again, and we're unconsciously preparing our own contribution to the pattern, often possible achievements and inexplicable knowledge that will outlast whatever catastrophe eventually resets our world. And when the time comes, we'll remember how to preserve what matters most, how to encode the essential knowledge in forms that can survive the flood and speak to whoever inherits the world we leave behind.